هیچ جنبش آزادیخواهی در هیچ کشوری در خلأ سیاسی منطقه صورت نمیگیره. یکی از خصلت‌های جمهوری اسلامی از بد خلقتش استفاده و سوء استفاده از بحران‌های منطقه‌ای بوده برای ابقاء خودش در رژیم. برای صحبت راجع به چگونگی جنبش سبز، چگونگی جنبش آزادیخواهی مردم ایران در چارچوب مسائل منطقه، امروز اومدیم پای صحبت یکی از پرآوازه ترین متفکرین مخالف سرای جهان، استاد نوم چومسکی در دانشگاه MIT در شهرک دانشگاهی کمبریج نزدیک بوستون. Noam, thanks very much for accepting our invitation. We are very, very grateful. I know how busy you are. As I said, the point of our conversation is about this movement, this democratic movement in Iran. But I would like to come close to it from the geopolitics of the region. Let's start with Iraq. What's your assessment of what's happening in Iraq?
It's fundamentally true, and I think what should be recognized is that what happened in Iraq is a very severe defeat for the United States. The U.S. had to abandon its major war aims, not because of insurgents. They could kill insurgents easily. The U.S.
Is Iraq any closer to any notion of democracy or self-rule?
Well, the U.S. was opposed to democracy in Iraq. You have to distinguish between the propaganda and the facts. If you look at everyone talks about democracy. I mean, so did Stalin. He wants democracy. But you have to look at the facts. The facts are that the U.S. fought very hard to prevent democratic development in Iraq, and it had to back off step by step in the face of nonviolent resistance. Actually, it's a triumph of nonviolent resistance. The U.S. could kill insurgents, but it couldn't do anything with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets after a call by Ayatollah Sistani or something. So they had to abandon all the caucuses, the manipulations, everything they tried to do. They had to finally accept elections. They tried to manipulate the elections, had to back off from that. In fact, without going through the story, towards the end, the U.S. was finally coming out very clearly with its war aims. At the beginning, they were kind of suppressed, weapons of mass destruction and so on. By November 2007, the Bush administration announced its war aims explicitly, and that was reiterated in January 2008. The goal must be to permit U.S. forces to carry out combat operations freely in the indefinite future, to have permanent military bases, and to make sure that U.S. corporations are privileged in access to Iraqi resources. Well, they were forced to accept a status of forces agreement, which at least on paper gave up on all of that, which is quite a victory for Iraqi nationalism. And as I said, for nonviolent resistance, because that's what did it. Obama so far has gone along with the Bush agreement. Now, what's happening to the military bases, we don't know. We know that they're still being built, but reporters don't investigate, and there's very little information. There is a huge so-called embassy, big city inside Baghdad, which is being expanded under Obama. Forces are there, about 50,000, and participating in some fashion in what goes on. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that it is a significant defeat and a victory for Iraqi nationalism. What they'll make of it is another story. Amnesty International just came out with a report showing about 30,000 prisoners in prison under horrifying conditions, many of them for 7 years, no charges, tortured.
Let's jump over Iran and go to the other side. What about Afghanistan? What is happening in Afghanistan since the surge?
Now, first of all, Afghanistan is split. It's a tribal society, so the results in the Tajik areas and the Pashtun areas are quite different. But I think it's pretty well agreed, including the U.S. command, that they're going to have some kind of negotiated solution. The Taliban are Afghans. They're going to have to somehow be integrated into whatever system comes out. The surrounding countries must be brought into it. It has to be a regional settlement. For example, a lot of what's going on in Afghanistan is a proxy war between Pakistan and India. And you can't pretend that that's not happening. That involves Kashmir and other things. So and of course Iran is involved. They have influence in the Herat area and so on. So unless there's a regional some kind of a regional settlement with Pakistan, Iran, India, the Central Asian republics that border on it, Russia, maybe China, the United States only because it's there. It has no authority to be there. But if they have to work out some kind of a regional settlement to which they're committed and which will oversee some kind of internal reconciliation, which will mean withdrawal of foreign troops. Now, and the Obama administration is trying to figure out some way to move towards that without conceding defeat, which is political. If you take a look at the polls here, the war is very unpopular. On the other hand, if it looks like a defeat.
Noam, what's your take on northern Pakistan? Just before the news of the flood, this massive flood, the questions of drone attacks of U.S.-led against Taliban targets were in the news. And one consequence of the so-called pacification of the Taliban in Afghanistan was that they moved towards northern Pakistan. What is your assessment of that?
Pakistan has been very seriously undermined by the war. Partly their own fault. That the ISI, the intelligence services, have been playing a very double game all along. They want to maintain their own position in Afghanistan. It's part of their general strategy with regard to India. They feel they have to have a position in Afghanistan, and they've been supporting both sides. And meanwhile, the so-called Pakistani Taliban have been expanding. The tribal regions had been essentially out of government control. It was the British had imposed a regime which essentially left the tribal provinces to their own devices. Under U.S. pressure, the Pakistani government has gone into the tribal areas, and a lot of violence and, of course, retaliation. And the drone attacks simply accelerated. Especially the Obama administration has stepped up this policy of targeted assassination. It's sharply escalated it in other places, too. That's just murder. The population is outraged naturally. People don't like it. Even the strongest, most strong anti-Taliban sectors of the population in Pakistan don't like their country attacked with drones. And in the regions, of course, it stirs up great anger. You can trace the examples. It's also flatly illegal. I mean, there's a very respected international lawyer, Philip Alston, who's the UN rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, they published a rather measured but moderate but quite strong report in which he simply said that no country, referring to the U.S., has an exemption from the laws against extrajudicial assassination, which is what the drone attacks are. They're trying to kill suspects and, of course, kill other people at the same time. Incidentally, acts have consequences. I mean, take Fallujah again. There were actually 2 attacks on Fallujah. The first one was in April 2004. Then the worst one was in November. You go back to the April one, there are important facts which just aren't getting reported. I mean, the April Marine attack in Fallujah, which practically inflamed the whole country, almost huge effect over the whole country. That was the result of the murder of 4 American contractors. Now, that murder didn't come out of the blue. That murder was carried out by a newly formed organization called Martyrs of Sheikh Yassin. And they published a statement saying that the murder of the contractors is the response of the people of Afghanistan to the Zionist murderers who had killed Sheikh Yassin in a targeted assassination. He was a revered figure, a quadriplegic cleric. He was attacked by U.S. helicopters. Israel didn't have helicopters. As he was leaving a mosque, and half a dozen other people got killed. Well, here that was sort of brushed over. Who cares? But it had an effect not only Afghanistan, but the whole region. One effect was the murder of the contractors. That led to the marine assault. That practically blew up the country. I mean, acts have consequences. And the drone attacks that Obama is escalating are going to have even bigger effects.
Before we turn to Iran, Noam, I wonder what's your take on the recent round of so-called peace process that is happening between the Palestinians and Israelis, mitigated by President Obama?
I'm glad you said so-called. I mean, if there were real negotiations, they would be moderated by some neutral element, maybe somebody from Mars, if you can find somebody neutral. And the two sides would be, on the one side, the United States and Israel, and on the other side, the world. Because the fact of the matter is that the United States and Israel, for 35 years, have been blocking an international consensus on peace, which has almost total agreement. It's hard to find anybody who doesn't agree to it. And everybody knows the terms of the settlement. It's on the international border, and minor mutual modifications, some settlements on Jerusalem and so on, which have been mostly worked out. Well, the U.S. blocks it. And the way it blocks it is by supporting the Israeli settlement programs. Now, the discussions now are farcical. The discussions are what's holding up the negotiations, if you read the papers, is plans to expand the settlements. Well, it's kind of a minor issue. The settlements are illegal. And if you look at the arrangement, and it's not in question that they're illegal. In fact, the Israeli government effectively recognized that back in 1967. That's been ratified by the World Court, by the Security Council. It's not open to debate. And the settlements are not, if you look at them, just take a look at a map, they're designed specifically to ensure that there cannot be any viable Palestinian state. In fact, the political program of the governing party in Israel stated that there can never be a Palestinian state. Okay, now they say the words, but meanwhile, Israel's taken over already 40% of the West Bank. It's separated it from Gaza, which is just a prison, and is expanding and the settlements are basically salients that cut through, so as to ensure that no viable entity can develop there. Now, you can't have negotiations over arguing over expansion of the settlements. This is like, it's like saying, well, there's a major crime, but somebody robbed the store, but I'm going to ask, did he take a match? It's.
But even the so-called two-state solution with West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, you don't anticipate anything of that sort coming from these negotiations?
Not from these negotiations, but I mean that's the solution that ought to be realized, and it's not impossible. I mean, it's in January 2001, the last month of Clinton's term, which happens to be the one time in the last 35 years when a U.S. president was willing to tolerate a political settlement along the lines of the consensus. They came pretty close. I mean, they met in Taba, Egypt. We have a lot of documentation on this, Israeli and other sources. They came very close to an agreement. In fact, their last press conference, the negotiators on both sides said that with a few more days they could reach an agreement pretty much along the lines of the general consensus. They didn't have those few more days. Israel called off the negotiations prematurely and it ended. But things have happened since then, but you could go back to that. The crucial fact is whether the U.S. will support it.